want to start by, when it comes to criminalization, it's very clear from the stories that we've heard from the activists is we need to imagine ways of protecting the rights of defenders in ways that are holistic, that cater to the different spaces that they occupy. That's something we've acknowledged that it's not one of the things that we have in the declaration. How do we talk about the rights of Mother Nature if we don't talk about the people who are standing in the forefront and defending Mother Nature? And not just talking about them, but talking about the bodies that are weaponized, the black and brown bodies in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the global south and the global north, when you talk about Canada, when you talk the tar sands in Canada, when you talk about activists in California and activists in Houston. So it's very clear that we need to imagine the bodies and the ways to protect the bodies that stand in front of the front lines that are always guarding the spaces. We also need to, the issue of criminalization of these defenders, we also need to look at this as a way to further enrich our discussions and understanding of the systemic and structural issues, such as capitalism and patriarchy. We need to borrow from, if I should say this, a feminist analysis of how this functions. It's not just about criminalization. We need to build our understanding of the system using the criminalization of these defenders. We also need, when we talk about rights, and this has come up severally, how can we demand rights from states whose DNA is built to destroy? How do we demand the rights of defenders from genocidal states? How do we demand for the rights of indigenous defenders? I think that's an element when we talk about rights, when you talk about legislation, when you talk about constitutions protecting our rights to protest. How can we get rights from such states and such systems? I acknowledge that our parliaments and our courts are still valuable sites of struggle, but we must go beyond acknowledging the fact that these spaces are valuable sites of struggle and reimagine new ways, new spaces. When you talk about legislation, when you talk about courts, when you talk about parliaments, we definitely do need to reimagine that. Otherwise, it's impossible for the rights of defenders to be protected from systems and spaces that are created to continue privileging the already privileged. At the same time, our conception of criminalization has to go beyond legislation, the legislation that is being used to stop protesters on the streets, legislation that is being used to stop the convoy of buses from this country to this other country. We need to look at, when you talk about criminalization, we need to capture the myriad of ways and spaces, such as our education systems, that make us passive, that make it okay to criminalize activism. And I'll borrow a very personal story that I did not know of Ken Saro-Wiwa until I was 21 years old. And I found out about him because I was reading one of the last short stories that he wrote before he died, Africa Kills Her Son. That is how I came to know Ken Saro-Wiwa. My understanding of Ken Saro-Wiwa as the environmental activist came much later. So we need to also transform spaces that we have. It's not just criminalization, and again, it's a heavy word. I don't want us to only conceptualize criminalization as legislation, but there are other ways, other spaces that stop people from acting out against injustice. And just maybe just to continue just a little bit more, we need a systems approach to the climate crisis. We need to talk about racism. We need to talk about class issue. We need to talk about colonization. We need to talk about patriarchy. We need to unpack what we mean by climate justice. We definitely need to borrow the ideas of climate justice from the defenders who we've seen here today. What does climate justice mean to activists in Texas? What does climate justice mean to defenders who are undocumented in spaces where borders are reinforced? We also need to understand climate justice from a perspective, from that particular perspective. We also need to reimagine our energy system, challenging and transforming our economic systems, transforming gender relations, resisting the privatization of the commons, our seeds, the privatization of our seeds, water, and land. And also we need to reinforce the radical idea that another world is possible and that our fight is unstoppable. And what we can clearly see from the presentation from the activists is that there are violations that have occurred here. Article 2(1)(j), the right to full and prompt restoration of violation of the rights recognized in this declaration caused by human activities. 2, each being has a right to a place and to play its role in Mother Earth for her harmonious functioning. And 3, every being has a right to well-being and to live free from torture or cruel treatment by human beings. I will not go into the beautiful discussions that have already been had about whether it's the IPCC or the UNFCCC. I believe we've had a brilliant discussion about that. I want to really focus on those who are in the front lines. And maybe just as a final, as I leave the stage, I want to leave with the words of Audre Lorde, a wonderful feminist that a lot of us, especially feminists of color, look to, that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And again, I want to salute every single defender, every single activist who puts their bodies, their emotional well-being, their families on the front lines to fight for climate justice and to fight for it in an intersectional way. We see you, we acknowledge you, we see you. Thank you very much.